So as we can see from the introductory polls, the majority of us don't have anything explicit integrated into our own research strategies. We certainly don't have a dedicated impact strategy, but at least half of us are working towards this or thinking about this. So lots of reasons why we might want to build an impact strategy, from the more kind of instrumental strategic reasons to these deeper strategic reasons around co-producing impact and driving culture change. But the first, and I think perhaps one of the most useful things that I want to suggest to you here, is just the different components of an impact strategy that we found in our review. Now, I'll come on to the review process in a moment, but ask yourself, if you are developing a strategy or thinking about it, do you have each of these components? And if not, is this something that you want to build in? So partnerships and engagement. Are you talking about specific partnerships, or the approach to partnerships and engagement that you take? Is this about civic engagement, public engagement, specific kind of targeted innovation partnerships? Perhaps you're going beyond partnerships to co-produce research, knowledge, and impacts with those partners. And perhaps you're building boundary organizations, so policy hubs, enterprise partnerships and initiatives and things like that. Is there an element of resourcing in here? Are we thinking about what resources are required to do the kind of impact that we actually want, and doing that in a strategic way? So we spend that money wisely, given that it will be limited. So we're focusing on the key areas that can give us the most impact. Training is a form of resourcing, lots of different capacities we might want to build as part of this. But do we have a plan for how we systematically build the capacity of our researchers? Great, we've got a strategy, but is there also an implementation plan? Do we have people responsible for doing this? Do we know if it's going to work or not? Are we monitoring and evaluating this? What systems do we have in place for that? And have we thought on purpose about how all of this stuff that we're doing on impact might actually help build a healthy impact culture? Because if we don't do that on purpose, then the things that we do in terms of impact strategy are likely to impact on our culture in ways that we're not sure about, which may or may not be healthy. So here's the research. I'm not going to this in any depth. I've given you a link already, and you can read in this on this in much more depth. We looked at the UK, Canada, Australia, Hong Kong, China, Denmark, New Zealand, and independent research organisations that don't have a specific jurisdictional kind of reach to them. And we did this to include different kind of cultural contexts, some non-English speaking countries, and strategies where necessary translated. It's not an entirely systematic sample. Within these, we tried to get all strategies that were publicly available from the country. And again, it's not complete, but we did as much as we could. We looked at the words, we looked at the themes that emerged, and that's where the majority of the analysis comes from. So here is that word frequency analysis, and I'll spend less time on this because I think it's probably the less interesting part, but I think there are some interesting differences. So in the UK, other than research and impact, as you might expect, we were just analysing the impact parts if it was an integrated research and impact strategy. So some obvious words that come out, but beyond those, we've got knowledge, policy and partnerships in the UK, compared to Australia, with a much greater emphasis on community and engagement. Then moving to New Zealand versus Canada, we've got, again, community in New Zealand, like Australia, but support and society, thinking a little bit broader. Canada, this KMB, an abbreviation for their version of the impact word, which is knowledge mobilization. And as a result, the word knowledge coming out, but also community and engagement. Hong Kong, China, we've got knowledge, community, community, partnerships and innovation coming in. Oops. And in Denmark, society, collaboration and sustainable coming in. So quite a strong emphasis on sustainable development goals in Denmark. Compared to other countries. And then these independent research institutes, large organizations working internationally, but a stronger focus on projects and on specific stakeholders. Now, looking across this, I think for me, the most interesting and perhaps challenging insights was the very explicit focus on partnerships with Indigenous groups, especially in Canada, Australia, and in New Zealand. And of course, there are some really live and important issues there. But I think for me, as a British person coming from a missionary family, many of my extended family were colonialists, and perhaps that's just, for me, it feels very real, very live for us in the UK, and yet pretty much absent in the UK. And I think that the UK is not alone in having a colonial legacy, and I think we could all and should all be doing more to decolonialize, or decolonize is the phrase I should use, our impact strategies and thinking about what we do in that space. I think the key finding, though, in the paper was there's two different types of strategy. And I'm going to ask you to think about this in some depth. I do have one more poll, and this is designed to get you to think, which of these fits me best? So I'm going to ask you in the poll if you have an impact strategy already, and that was a few of us. Which of these does it fit into, or is it actually a combination of the two? I won't ask this in a poll, but I would like you to discuss after I finish presenting and Saskia concludes, which of these do you feel drawn to? Which of these fits your needs? So the enabling impact strategies were more likely to be developed by universities and research institutes. Less likely to be these the international organizations, but we do see a mix. Less likely to be the smaller units, so it's usually these kind of big university scale type things that we're looking at here. There's a really strong emphasis on building impact capacity, and more likely to be explicit mention of culture. In both of them, there is this focus on partnerships and engagement, but in the enabling ones, much more likely to be a focus on either industry and or local communities and civic engagement. And the enabling impact strategies were more likely to talk about investing in dedicated impact teams with specific roles and responsibilities. And they would have extrinsic incentives, so rewards such as promotion criteria. Now, the achieving impact strategies, of course, have some overlap. And so, first of all, this emphasis on partnerships and engagement again. But in this case, much more likely to target specific beneficiaries with structured implementation plans. So we've got very specific impact goals. We know who's going to benefit from them. We've even got things like a theory of change and some diagrams built into this to explain exactly how we might get there. Is that what you need, rather than something broader, more general? They enable an organization often to operate or transition towards operating more as a boundary organization. So we are now that organization sitting between all of these key players, integrating insights, finding out what is necessary to add value across and between these organizations. And so as a result, acting as this kind of catalyzer to bring people together and co-produce both research and impact. They often had mechanisms to support and facilitate best practice, and that was often operating at the scale of not just kind of rewarding individuals, but saying, look, what are people doing well at the scale of those individual projects or teams, and how can we replicate that? And they would recognize impact in lots of different ways like that, but were much less likely to rely on those extrinsic types of rewards like promotions criteria. Now let's dive into this in a bit more depth. There's a table in the paper, and I'm just going to pull out any things that we've missed in this. So I think we've got most of those already in terms of how I have unpacked this. Yeah, impact training. Let's look at this one, because that was one that I didn't look at specifically before. And this was something that was across all of the strategies. No clear difference between the enabling impact strategies or the achieving impact strategies. But if you have impact training in your own strategy, or you're thinking about this, then have a think about how you might want to adapt this to different disciplinary contexts. Is there a one-size-fits-all? Does this need to be tailored? Policy engagement skills, great, but that's not just necessarily for everyone. The business industry engagement type stuff, again, certain types of research, certain disciplines, fields more likely to engage in different kinds of contexts. But also think about your own operational context, so international development, for example, versus kind of more civic society type stuff. We might need some quite specific and very different skills and awareness when we're going into overseas countries, different cultures and the like. Great, so I think I've covered most of these as well. Good, so let's have a think. Did you understand this difference between the enabling versus the achieving impact strategies? So I'm going to put my poll up now, and I will go back to the original page so you can see what this looks like. Yep, here we are. So here's what I mean by enabling versus achieving. And which are you? As I said, it's often a bit blurry. So as a typology, you could argue it's not great, but I think better to have something here to help you structure your thinking. It's not just a checklist of different components. I can now take a different approach to how I emphasize or build in these different components. And these are now the two key approaches. So 3 seconds left on this. Let's see what people are doing. And if you don't currently have an impact strategy, you don't need to vote. And we can see that the majority of us are in this enabling impact strategy space. But a few, in fact, yeah, second most popular is we've got a combination of the two. So if you are in that space of developing your strategy, your question now for debate is, which of these do I feel drawn to and why? Which would serve my purpose and context most effectively? Now, in the sample that we managed to find, we just, as I said, found as many as were publicly available that we could get our hands on in each of these countries. There was a bias, like we have today, towards those enabling impact strategies. And as I said, they have these mechanisms for rewarding impact. And again, you can think about this as a bit of a checklist. Here are some things I could consider building into my impact strategy. And at this point, I want to segue into the deeper stuff that people were thinking about when it came to impact culture. Because as I said at the beginning, if you start this with the idea that we're just going to create a strategy and culture will happen, then you may inadvertently shape your culture in ways you don't intend to. And I think that if you say impact is important, but you don't put your money where your mouth is, and there are none of these extrinsic rewards, then people will probably rightly question how serious you are about impact. And yet, if these are front and center, and this is what you are leading with, and this is what is most visible and what everyone's talking about, then my suggestion is that you could inadvertently create an impact culture which is very instrumental, which is about, I do impact to get reward. And in fact, what you end up doing is creating or exacerbating, in the UK, I would argue, a conflict of interests. So I'm not just doing impact because I want to help someone or for the public good. I'm doing this to get promotion, to get out of my teaching, to get a prize or whatever else it might be. And I suggest that it is this link between impact and extrinsic incentives that is driving the majority of the negative unintended consequences that we see today, especially in countries like Britain, where we have very tightly coupled these two from impact. So What we want instead, I'm going to suggest, is to move towards a more co-productive impact culture. So when you don't think about this, and when you heavily instrumentalize this with lots of extrinsic incentives, we end up moving towards the bottom right-hand quadrant of this. This is from my impact culture book and paper. A corporate impact culture. So this is all about managing impact as another strategic commodity that we need to count and reward and manage and make happen like anything else. As we all know, good things can come from that, many good things, and we are all doing more impact now probably than we ever were, despite the fact that many of us are operating in these impacts, in these corporate impact cultures, but of course, negative unintended consequences. I think probably the easiest thing to fall into is this kind of research and impact kind of afterthought type cultures, where we have created an impact strategy, but it's not properly integrated with our research, and we don't really have that sense of building this into our stakeholder communities and seeing what they actually want. It's no, we're doing this to tick some boxes, and we've got impact, trust us, it's all good, it's under control, here it is in our strategy, but we're not really paying attention to what's going on more broadly. And we have these individual impact cultures, which have strengths and weaknesses as well, as you can see. Read a bit more about them in the paper. I'm not going to go into that just now, but what I'm going to suggest, and this is perhaps my own biases, I'll let you disagree if you're not keen on this idea, but I'm going to suggest that what we're looking for are these co-productive impact cultures that to give researchers that sense of individual agency linked to their own passion, goals, their own sense of identity and values, and yet at the same time are integrated with those shared purposes where their identities and values intersect with others out there beyond the academy, trying to achieve those broader aims together. And so if we want to move towards those kinds of cultures, then in our paper we've argued that we need to pay more attention to what is researched and how we conduct our research. So we're not just looking at the problems, we're trying to research and understand the solutions. This is robust, it's ethical research. We think about how impact interacts with the intrinsic motivations of our researchers. And we don't try and corporatize this to a shared mission, a set of values that we all share, but in reality are just kind of motherhood and apple pie statements. And we can have them in there, but we don't expect people to all buy into them, because in an institution that values academic freedom, we expect there to be multiple subcultures that don't necessarily all work together towards the same purpose, but in those subcultures, we all share a similar or at least compatible purpose. And we build capacity. So this is for skills, it's resources, it's leadership, it's also strategic and learning capacity. And when we think about those things, rather than just, yeah, we'll give a bit more money to our training arm, these are the things I would argue we need to do if we want to create these more co-productive impact cultures. I'm running out of time, so I'm going to go through my final slides. I've got 4 concluding slides with 8 lessons, 2 lessons per slide, and then I'll hand over to Saskia for some final insights. The first of these lessons is that, as I said, you need to decide which type of strategy. It's not just, have I got all the right components in here? I need to think of the approach that is going to meet my goals, my purpose, my context. And I think that a really nice way of starting to do this is not from our corporate strategy, but instead from the bottom up, to actually look at who are our stakeholders, what are their needs. And now let's look at what are our strengths, our capabilities, what are our researchers doing, what are they great at, what are they passionate about, and looking at that intersection and then building from there. Next, I think that we need to consider the roles and responsibilities that we need to achieve those goals. So we start from the bottom up, and if that's what we want to achieve, then what do we need to achieve that? And of course, there will be a limit in what we can actually do there. So we need to be strategic. And I would suggest that we need to invest more proactively in these strategic areas based on this needs analysis. So great, it's not just what are we great at, but where is that intersection between what we are great at and what the world needs. And for impact, that's where I invest, where I can, rather than spreading resources so thinly that I can't actually get the depth of engagement or the longevity of engagement and trust that I really need. And that's hard. That's what being strategic is all about, though. And it's about saying, yeah, we don't actually invest equally in everything to keep everyone happy. We look at where we can make a really big difference. We've got then this idea of investing in stakeholder engagement, in your partners, thinking about how you can keep things alive between projects. There's a lot of critique about the projectification of research, and we have these kind of spurts of activity, and then the funding runs out and everything runs dry, and people feel left high and dry. What can we do institutionally in these core strategic areas to keep things going between projects and actually build stuff across projects strategically? I've talked about boundary organisations in depth and the role of knowledge brokers. Are there roles you want to fund and create that can enable us to build those long-term relationships with key other people out there in our communities? And can we, in fact, reconceive of our entire organisation at an institutional level, potentially, not just for the independent research groups or research institutes and centres, but in entire universities reframed as boundary organisations? I think it's possible. But let's always remember, a strategy is nothing without an implementation plan. And whether this is something that is devolved to subunits, you have a plan to make those plans, even if they're not actually in your strategy. And my final point, great, you might want to include some of those intrinsic incentives, but to proceed with caution. So I'm going to hand over at this point to Saskia for, if that's okay, about 5 minutes, I think we've got for some final thoughts from you, Saskia. Over to you.
Thank you very much, Mark. Yeah, brilliant summary of the work that we did. And of course, I was listening to that and reflecting, I guess, about the period of time that has elapsed since we originally worked on that document. And obviously writing and publishing an academic journal article takes a huge amount of time, even longer, I think, in the sort of post-COVID environment. And so life goes on during that time and things change. And of course, we're still involved in those conversations and engagements with organisations that are making these developments and thinking these things through during that period of time. And obviously, I've been having those conversations myself. So while you were talking, Mark, I was just reflecting about kind of what's happening on the ground that might maybe shed some light on some of those issues in the current environment. And I've got a scrappy piece of paper that I've put my notes on, so it won't be very fluent. But the first point I wanted to pick up on was the fact that the majority of organisations represented here today would describe something that they have or are working on as an enabling strategy. And so I think it might be interesting to think about why that might be, and if there is any benefit in thinking about where the more achieving strategies might fit into that conversation. So I think one of the challenges is that the achieving strategies tend to focus, the question they tend to ask is, what do you want to change, rather than what do you want to know? And I think it's far easier for researchers to think about what they want to know rather than what they want to change. Some researchers are very clear about, they have a change objectives in mind and they can work towards those. But at an organisational level, I think that's a lot more difficult. And so is there anything that we can do to bring those two things closer together? And I think as organisations think about developing their strategies, it tends to be a top-down thing. This is something, as an organisation, the organisational leadership wants to have a strategy, again, so that they can perhaps meet their broader objectives, so that they can allocate resourcing and so on, all the things that Mark thought about. And that's usually a sort of a very top-down process. But maybe there's an opportunity to think about creating these more achieving focused or more change focused strategies at a smaller level. So perhaps, you know, at a senior organizational level, you could kind of set the agenda, say that this is what you want to do, maybe set up a framework, resource your departments and your different disciplinary areas to think about what they might want to see change, create those achieving strategies at a lower level, and then take an overarching view and think, okay, so this is what we want to do as an organization. How are we going to enable that, and what do we really need to put in place? And I think that would be a very different way of doing things, and a sort of a revolutionary way of doing it, which I think may produce something which is kind of much more impactful. So that's my first challenge to you all out there, to think about sort of turning this on its head and seeing how that might work. The second point I wanted to make was about the sort of clash of cultures between knowledge exchange and impact. And this is particularly prevalent in the UK at the moment. It may be relevant in other parts of the world as well. I'm sure there are these issues, because as far as I conceptualize it, knowledge exchange is essentially the process and impact is the outcome. But there are also lots of other things around both knowledge exchange and impact that kind of muddy the waters a bit, because knowledge exchange is broader than research. You know, obviously student entrepreneurship, some of the more sort of civic related activities can be around to generate or can be facilitated by knowledge exchange. And so if knowledge exchange in research is the process and impact is the outcome, which bit are you interested in? And you can't really be interested in one without the other. I mean, I was at a meeting which was focusing on knowledge exchange, particularly looking at the KEF. And one of the key issues that the participants in that were interested in was, how do you align knowledge exchange and impact? And when you look at these organizational strategies, often you'll see that knowledge exchange and impact are in two different parts of the document. You know, they're like seen as two different things. And I think a current issue of extreme interest to anybody who wants to think about this is, how do you bring those two things together? Because if you have knowledge exchange without an interest in impact, you know, what's the point? Where is it going? What, you know, to what ends are you doing this engagement work? And if you're only focusing on impact, you're focusing too much on the outcomes. Maybe you're going to focus too much on these kind of extrinsic things, and maybe you're going to be isolated from sort of co-production and partnership working a little bit. So I think that is something that's going to be a very live issue, and thinking about how we bring those two things together. And if you're working on that now, I think that's something to take seriously and kind of start from here. And then the last point I want to make is about which builds on the needs assessment point that Mark made towards the end. And it's really about how to make some of these enabling strategies work, particularly in the post-COVID environment. I think there is, I mean, I was going to say that often organizations find it hard to get traction for training. I mean, I look at the list of participants here today and I think, okay, well, maybe it's not such a problem. But I think thinking about more imaginative ways of supporting researchers to do this work is really important. I've also recently been involved in a survey of researchers looking at their knowledge exchange and impact work, looking at what they need, what sort of support they need, and so on. Everybody who works in this area knows that workload, time, you know, are always at the top of this list. And so maybe there are different things that we need to think about in terms of making it work. And you know, in a very small way, some of those things might include providing coaching support for researchers rather than just sort of offering broad brush training. I mean, certainly in my experience, impact is an extremely diverse area. I mean, there are things that you can learn to do, you know, within a training course, but in terms of understanding how to develop your own impact, that is a very specific thing. And so something like coaching and mentoring can really help there. I think also some of the work around funding is really, really valuable in different organisations. So when you offer pots of money to support impact work, researchers really, really appreciate that. But often what is almost more valuable than the small amount of money you may be offering is the support that you can package around that. So if you've got people who can help optimise applications for that sort of money, and if you can help deliver outcomes through the process of spending that money, that brings researchers along, I think, a lot more than some of these other sorts of interventions. And then also thinking about whether you can create virtual teams. I mean, you know, in some areas of research, there are actual teams, and that's fantastic. And you can split the work between those. You can perhaps support different members of the team to develop different skills and support the group as a whole. But where those teams don't exist, maybe there's an opportunity to create virtual teams to support research impact. And that might be bringing together people who work in knowledge exchange, people who work on impact. One of the differences that I see between people who work on impact and people who work on knowledge exchange is that impact people tend to be inward looking. So they will look within an organization and think, okay, what can we do to support researchers to move outside the organization? And in knowledge exchange, people tend to look outside and say, okay, what can we do to support the needs of people outside by connecting researchers with those? And so bringing those two things together, I think, is going to be an important direction of travel over the next few years.
Fantastic. Thank you, Saskia. And you can see just the wealth of knowledge that comes from just engaging in practice, trying to help people create these strategies in different contexts. And that's why it was such a pleasure to collaborate on the paper together and get that combination of insights from academic and professional practice integrated in. So questions, over to you. And I think what we'll do is let's make sure we answer all the questions, and if need be, we'll just have some informal chat afterwards as the community. And Rebecca's kicked us off. So great to have you back. Thanks for coming, Rebecca. And the question is, this tension between knowledge exchange and impact, is it a similar thing with public engagement? And I do tend to find this in my own experience. I've had big arguments with NERC, for example, the national funder of natural environment research in the UK, and why it is that they've got a public engagement strategy and not an impact strategy, and why their public engagement strategy is all about engagement and not really about impact. And surely you should be prioritizing whatever is the most relevant pathway to impact. And so public engagement might be, for certain contexts and for certain purposes, public engagement, great, but what about industry engagement? What about policy engagement? And the response was, well, all of that is included in public engagement. And I'm like, yeah, okay, but that's not the general kind of understanding of public engagement. And so I think that there are just different communities that have built up, and there's a public engagement community, there's a knowledge exchange community, there's an impact community. And for me, whatever your language, you know, let's go to Canada, let's call it knowledge mobilization. The point is that we're all clear that there is an end point, which is a public good at the end of this, a benefit for someone somewhere, whether that's future generations, non-human species. That is our end point, and we choose the most relevant way of getting there, and then strategically we support that adaptive approach to then co-produce impacts with the relevant publics or policymakers or industries to then reach that goal. Saskia, I wonder if you want to respond to that or any of the other questions that are coming.
Sure. I mean, I think there are, you know, public engagement is a pathway like a lot of the other knowledge exchange pathways. So, and your point about NERC and public engagement, it's also ESRC. It has got a current interest in commercialization, you know, and they're encouraging organisations to think about commercialization in their particularly in their application for this sort of new follow-on funding mechanism, the IAA that we have in the UK. And you know, and so you know, research organizations tend to respond to what funders want because they want to make sure that the money keeps coming, and that, you know, that's completely understandable. But I think you're right. We need to think about what do you want to achieve, and therefore what is the most appropriate pathway for you to achieve that. And that's how those two things are really going to come together. And of course, there are broader issues for public engagement, like the Alpha Knowledge Exchange, than just research impact. So public engagement might sometimes be about recruiting more students, for example, getting interest with that sort of section of the public to a particular topic. And so when we're talking about creating research impact, we need to bear in mind those specific requirements. Iona has asked about embedding funding in grant applications. And this is also another very, very live issue, particularly in the UK, because of the removal of a separate pathways to impact document some months ago from the grant application process. And I'm also obviously involved in talking to researchers about that, and to organisations about how to support their researchers to think about how to embed impact in grant applications, rather than have it as what was feared to be a bolt-on in the previous mechanism. I think researchers do, Iona says that researchers rarely do that. They're still looking for external pots of funding. And it's absolutely essential, I think, that researchers do look for opportunities to provide an impact strategy within their grant applications in a way that's appropriate for the particular call. So again, these things always depend on exactly what you're doing. But supporting researchers with impact planning. So not only within funding applications, but generally thinking about what do you want to achieve in terms of impact from your research, and then what's the appropriate way to fund that research and impact package is going to be really essential, I think.
Yeah, great. Really nice question, Iona, and also painting a history of the evolution of language around us in the UK. And as we saw from our analysis, different evolutions of language in different countries. And fine, use different words, but let's make sure that we all actually focus on what matters. I think that the challenge for me is that for more pure science or non-applied arts and humanities type projects where this is about public engagement, that's effectively the pathway to impact. And one thing I regularly tell researchers is that whenever the research councils in the UK have asked for a specific amount, it's been 10% for the public engagement, knowledge exchange, impact element of proposals. And yet, I spoke to ESRC at the time, they put one out and they said, yeah, when we do this, we typically get back something like 4%. And part of the reason is that people are worried that reviewers will see this as not good enough value for money. And so the key thing is that you integrate in, and maybe 5% is a sweeter spot if you're worried about that, but still 5% is better than nothing, and you justify that effectively. For most researchers, though, the way to justify this that they feel comfortable is to integrate this as research. So is that doing some research about the public engagement and evaluation, and we're going to write that up as a paper? This feels like better value now for me as a researcher. But for most of us, I think this is about trying to ask, is there an applied element, an applied work package that we could add into this proposal so that this is now much more integrated into what we're doing? And let's think about the applied research and ultimately what happens from that applied research and how we would evaluate that and write that up. And that gets researchers much more excited about that end point. Yet we do applied research and we see how it works in policy and practice, wherever, and we evaluate that and write that up. I've got additional outputs now, and this clearly looks and feels like value for money for a researcher. So there's a question from Philly for you, Saskia. I'm not sure if you saw this. Iona has responded. Saskia.
Yeah, so this question is about time and how to make sure things like knowledge exchange and impact are built into the role without adding extra tasks and responsibilities. This is something that is something that we're wrestling with the whole time, and I don't think there is an easy answer. But what I would say is that researchers and those who support this sort of work are often thinking about adding extra time for this. So often typically researchers' workload will be split into research, teaching and administration. And there's a thought that maybe this sort of impact and knowledge exchange work might be added as a category somewhere. As somebody who supports the generation of impact from research, my feeling is that this ought to be part of research work. So research should encompass this sort of work. So the time allocated to research should also incorporate this. I think the danger and the problem with that at the moment is that this work is much more risky. You know, even putting in an application for a grant is risky in the sense that are you going to get your grant or not? It's highly competitive, so that time spent doing that is a risk. Time, I guess, spent writing publications. So, you know, if you think about what the drivers of sort of good research work are extrinsically, or are you producing, which is all going to help you develop your career. The impact and engagement work can be a lot more risky because it takes a long time. People don't necessarily understand the different steps in the process, and maybe the outcomes are going to be less clear cut. And so I think that's one of the reasons why researchers are reluctant to include it in their research workload. And so I think that there are those research culture things, those organisational support and recognition mechanisms. Changing that is the thing that is really going to make a difference. But equally, those things like I mentioned, like creating teams, virtual teams, having tangible support to enable this work to come about, rather than, for example, just providing training and relying on researchers to sort of carry out that training and become experts in different areas. There are other ways in which we might be able to support people to do this.
Great. I agree with everything you're saying. I think I would answer this kind of three levels. I think first is actually starting in a slightly different place in terms of how can we more motivate and inspire researchers to want to do impact for their own reasons. Intrinsically, I'm a curiosity-driven researcher, but how can engaging with impact enable me to be more curious, more creative, rise to new challenges, see the world in new ways? And so for me, a lot of the task around training is not just about skills, it's about making those connections and inspiring people, motivating people intrinsically. Once you've done that, then you can build those skills. And for me, when you're looking at as an individual, I don't have time for something, but it's important. The question is it really that important to you? Because you always make time for things that are really important to you. And so the first step is to actually raise the importance of this psychologically for people, that I want to do this for me, for my own reasons, and now I find the time, and of course I've got the skills because I've had the training, etc. But that might feel like a bit of a cop-out. So another very different approach to this is to go via these broader structures. So what can we do as an institution to make this more efficient, to look for economies of scale? So for example, now a bottom-up approach to developing an impact strategy might be to say, within each unit, let's look at what are the existing funded projects, including PhD projects, what are their impact goals, put them all into a matrix and look for the overlapping goals, overlapping stakeholders. Can we now actually get some economies of scale when we look at this across a university? Yeah, actually there's a whole load of people working with the same group, planning a similar kind of event. Let's actually pool resources and make this quicker and easier for people to be able to do. Are there knowledge broker roles that we can employ where we've got people who are now building those long-term relationships, so that's there's one person who's paid who is going to be there in the long term, rather than everyone having to build their own relationships from scratch. And that's not to say we don't still do that, but that could again just add that efficiency. And so then all of that boundary organization stuff, I think, can enable us to do this stuff at scale much more efficiently than everyone having to do it for themselves from scratch and actually overlapping, creating stakeholder fatigue and the like.
Yeah, Mark, I completely agree with that. And I think, you know, the issue of impact planning and thinking about actually work, identifying your goals, how you're going to work towards those, what pathways you're going to choose, and then embedding those boundary organizations and stakeholder engagement plan in there really helps with efficiency as well as effectiveness. Because I often talk to researchers who say, oh yeah, I'm doing this work on how to increase the ability of social workers to communicate with teenagers, but I've also been asked to go and do philosophy in the pub, so that's obviously going to help with my engagement. But actually, if you've got a plan about engaging with a particular stake, then you know what to say no to as well as what you are going to do, and so that will also, I think, help free up time and make the impact process more efficient.
Yeah, that strategic approach needs to cascade from the institution right down to the individual who can now say, yeah, actually, public engagement, media engagement is the way that I'm going to generate enough interest to get this change. And actually, for many of us, for the majority of us, actually, it's targeted stakeholder engagement that is actually going to achieve the change. And I'm potentially just wasting my time in creating more noise than I need, or more leads than I need, have got time to pursue by doing public engagement or media engagement. And I actually say no to the majority of requests I get for media engagement. So do it, great, but do it for a purpose, do it for a reason, not just because you've been asked or your ego is saying it would be a nice thing.
Yeah, and quality, not quantity, is often the case, isn't it? Talking with some researchers the other day who had made a decision to hold a very small meeting, essentially, rather than a large conference, and that meeting generated impact in a completely different way than a big splashy conference would have done, even though their sort of instinct might have been to originally put something splashier on.
Fascinating. So we are at 10. So many great examples. Thank you, Saskia. And I think hopefully you've all got your own examples in your own minds that you're thinking about. But I'd like to move to a specific example now. In the on the web page that you can see there, we've pulled out some examples of good practice, because I was pretty sure we were going to be asked. So here's your plan. What does this actually look like in practice? And so this is one of the examples that we've drawn. Thanks to those of you who have to go. I knew a few of you had an engagement on the hour, so you can catch up on the video recording. Fear not, and I'll send a link to that later. So I'm going to hand over to Jen and Dawn from the Plymouth Marine Laboratory. Could you start just by introducing your roles? And I'll also put a link to the podcast that we have done, all four of us, for those of you who can't make the final half hour. But over to you, Jen and Dawn.
Hi, thanks, Mark. Hi, everybody. Thanks for having us here today. So my name is Jenny Lockett. I'm the Senior Impact Manager here at Plymouth Marine Laboratory, and this is my colleague Dawn.
And I work in the Communications Department, so I'm a Senior Communications Officer. So we have that sort of mix of sort of knowledge exchange and impact between us and our team.
So our brief from Mark and Saskia was to try and talk about the process of developing the impact strategy for PML, which I'm going to cover, and then Dawn's going to talk a little bit about the how we're actually delivering it and what the plan looks like. So, and then hopefully we'll have some time at the end for questions as well. So just in case people haven't heard of us, Plymouth Marine Laboratory in the southwest UK is an independent marine research centre. We're not a teaching facility, although we do have PhD students here. We're much more about delivering research projects. So we're a registered charity governed by trustees. To get a sense of scale, we've got around 164 staff. And we have a massive range of projects going on all the time, from local scale stuff to global, but literally in the hundreds of projects will be active at any one time. Covering a range of different science disciplines: social science, modelling, biogeochemistry, benthic science, just really is a range of stuff, and lots of Earth observation as well, using satellite imagery for science. So we have got a very good reputation. Our papers are among the most highly cited for our disciplines, and been recognised for delivering world-class science. So hopefully that just gives a little background of who we are. So in 2014 in the UK, the Natural Environment Research Centre, a key funding body in the UK, started a review of their research centres, and it was followed very much the university REF evaluation. So it evaluated impact as well as academic success. And we weren't included in that review. But we were informed that we would be in the next one. So we had a nice warning that we had some time to prepare, look at all our impact work and to prepare impact case studies. There was also a key driver around funding, because here in the UK, there's been a real growing emphasis in different funding streams that we need to demonstrate in our proposals how we're going to deliver impact and show impact goals, and particularly things like official development assistance, ODA funding, that looks for you to include log frames and theory of change and such like. So that was another key driver. But also, as an organisation, there's very strong aspirations here for delivering academic and non-academic impact. So these were the kind of key things that were coming together at that time. At which point I was asked to start working on impact here. So I originally started at PML as a project manager, and then I was really fortunate to be given the time to kind of grow into this space and do lots of training and learn about impact approaches and such like, and to start writing these case studies. And then in 2018, when I came back from maternity leave, Dawn joined me working on it as we were really ramping up for the 2020 submission. But I mean, it's important to say neither of us have ever been completely impact staff here. We have kind of dual roles, obviously Dawn in the communications team and me still with a foot in the project management work, although mine, particularly from April, has become way more about impact, and I don't think I do any project management at the moment. But at the same time, we established an impact committee, so we had kind of a group of senior members of staff that oversaw the kind of development of the impact, particularly the development of the case studies for the NERC review. And at that time, we were working towards delivering about 10 case studies and then refining down to select just the most likely to score well cases. So these are the 4 that got submitted in the end. I hope this just gives a sense of the kind of work and impact that we have. So we were absolutely crucial in bringing about the ban on microplastic beads in the UK, all to do with our research on how they impact phytoplankton. We've used a lot of the Earth observation techniques, have informed boundaries of marine protected areas. We've been absolutely pivotal in the UN Conference of Parties climate change groups and meetings that have happened, where we've really emphasised the role of the ocean. Obviously, there wasn't much talk about the ocean in those conferences for a long time, and it was really our scientists that were there pushing for marine to be included. And also around natural capital and valuing ecosystem services and bringing in those approaches. So they were submitted in January 2020. And I mean, we were obviously delighted with the results we received, because we were the highest scoring of all the NERC centres. So this really did help to give us a boost in what we were delivering and knowing we were on the right track. So alongside that, kind of before we submitted the REF, the case studies, we were already very aware that the process we were going through of looking very retrospectively back to gather evidence was really time consuming and often led to dead ends, and lots of the evidence had been lost. And opportunities where we could have actually tailored some of our own evidence had been lost as well. So one of the key things we were very aware of is how do we learn from this process to go forward, so that in the future when we're developing case studies, it's a much more streamlined approach. But also not to miss out on impact opportunities. We were finding instances where we could have delivered more advanced, more broad, more significant impact, but the research hadn't been tailored that way, and it fell short. It didn't reach the right people or get in the right format. So we were also very aware that we didn't want to miss out on opportunities going forward. And the other kind of key driver at that time was around understanding where our colleagues were, because we knew there were pockets of people within the organisation that really understood impact, were delivering high quality impact, but we didn't understand across the breadth of the organisation where everybody was. So one of the first things we did was a staff survey. And this was really insightful because it did show us that a lot of staff were quite confident about impact plans, particularly in the sense of developing pathways to impact, because at that stage they were still part of proposals. But they were less certain of actually putting these into practice. So it was one thing to create pathways to impact for the proposals, but it was quite another thing to actually really deliver them. There was a strong desire for training in impact skills, particularly around monitoring and evaluation of our impact work. But there was quite a lack of understanding about the role of the researchers in this. And there was a feeling sometimes that that was done by the people, whether it was the comms team or project management or impact. There was this feeling like somebody else would do that for me. And obviously we needed to get away from that and show it was a collaborative approach that needed everyone's involvement. And there was a strong feeling that it wasn't as recognised or rewarded as well as academic success. So that was something else that we became quite aware of. So the first thing we did then was map out kind of what an impact plan would look like, what we would want from an impact plan, and set some kind of key objectives for it. So one of the key themes of that was around culture and approaches that we had here, and how we kind of, proposals were always approached from a starting point of what research do we want to do, rather than what do we want to achieve, what's the impact, what's the change goal. So I'm not saying we will ever get where we've completely turned that on its head, but what we're looking for is more of a middle ground where we're considering both from the very outset. How do we ensure that the evidence is collected in a timely way? And how do we make sure that there's clear systems and tools for embedded and that we're utilising the evidence? The third kind of strong theme was around our external relationships and how do we make the most of them? How do we strategically plan within each individual project the engagement that we need to have? I mean, it's just like Saskia and Mark were just talking about, we need to identify who the right target audiences are in each instance and prioritize them. And we can't have a blanket engagement strategy for every project. We have to be tailored. Also kind of trying to look horizon scanning, what were the priorities of those stakeholders and what did they have on their desk, what they hot topics that they needed information and knowledge about. And ensuring there's kind of ongoing dialogue, because often we had this issue where we were working with stakeholders project by project and not having the longer term or overarching view of those relationships and how they should be managed as an organisation, not just project by project. In parallel with all of this, we were developing science to impact challenge areas at PML. So this was very much from Steve Whittaker, our Director of Science, kind of brought this into PML. And although we have kind of 5 science areas that are based around the disciplines, we wanted to have these kind of overarching, cross-cutting themes around challenges. And these 5 were identified as key to our organisation. So obviously cleaner seas, combating biodiversity loss, understanding and mitigating climate change, improving sustainability of fisheries and aquaculture, and delivering marine autonomy, technology and digitisation. So these were kind of now embedded within our organisation as cross-cutting work areas that helped to bring about interdisciplinary working. So we contacted quite a few impact consultancies because we were very aware we needed some external advice and input to this process. And we reached out to Mark as well for his advice, and he suggested Saskia to us, which was absolutely brilliant. We ended up meeting with a few consultants and discussing this ask, those objectives we'd mapped out. And I'm very pleased to say Saskia was appointed because it ended up with a really fruitful relationship between the three of us. So, and some of these slides I've shamelessly stolen from Saskia's presentations that she did for us at the beginning now. She very much she reviewed the draft impact case studies before they were submitted and gave us feedback on those. She did analysis of PML strategies, and she also came to PML and did detailed kind of discussions with individually with each of the impact committee members. Which she was actually the last visitor we had before everything shut down for COVID. So we were lucky we sneaked her in the door before everything went a bit virtual. And that was really useful because those senior members of staff, I think, were more open and honest with her, and she asked the right questions than if we had done it ourselves. So Saskia then kind of compiled all of that information and then came back to us with a presentation and with recommendations. And I'm going to run through, as I say, some of her slides now to show what that looked like. So she felt like we were between impact approaches at that stage, and that we needed to move to kind of how we could have more of a change-focused, impact-focused organisation based around the use of theory of change. And she presented us with this as a kind of very early draft version of what an what a theory of change could look like for PML as an organisation, and with a strong link to the stick areas that I just talked about. She also identified some key factors that had come up in the interviews and such like. So this is just one example of the kind of stuff she fed back to us. This was around capacity and capability. So recognizing that there were pockets of highly active and very staff that understood impact very well, but that wasn't across the organization, and that all staff should be empowered. I think some of this came from our CEO, he was then Director of Science, but now CEO, about that not all researchers have to do impact, and not all researchers have to be in the same position. You know, we still, of course, value blue sky science and discovery science, but all of them should have the opportunities to engage in impact skills. So this was quite strong, drivers for us from our senior management. And from that, she gave us recommendations. So again, this is just an example of one of the sets of recommendations, but there were several. So these were around training and coaching and having the right resources available to support the process. Alongside that, she gave us kind of suggested layouts, templates, and in isolation and adjusting to a new world. But we really got stuck into writing around the structure. This would actually be delivered in practice. We were supporting the development of the Science to Impact Challenge areas at the same time. So they were developing their own impact goals and such like. And we were really advising on how that language was evolving and how they made sure that they really were impact focused. We were also consulting with quite a few other key groups that we needed to embed impact into as part of the strategy. So human resources and our IT departments, marketing, or a whole range of different groups we were speaking to and getting their input and talking about what we would like to embed in their processes, such, as in recruitment, for instance, and bonuses and reward systems here. That needed all to be co-developed with the HR group. So once we kind of gone through that long stage, we presented to the Impact Committee. This was quite actually a bit of a challenging stage that we'll talk about a little bit more later, but you know, it was a first for PML doing up this plan, and people on that board didn't have experience of other plans, you know, in an organisation like ours. So it took some negotiating and some time to understand from both sides and start doing some of the revisions that were needed. I mean, it wasn't necessarily extensive to what we'd written, but it was some of the nuances around how we structured things and presented things to put the science staff at the absolute centre of what we were doing. So this is just an example of a graphic that we then created to help communicate that with, as you see, research staff very much at the centre, and what they do around project design and the project life cycle being the main kind of centre cog. And then these outer cogs being the activities of other teams that feed in and support at the various stages. So our activities, but also the science to impact challenge areas and communication teams and such like. So we were also costing up what it would look like in reality in terms of resources for our time, and again consulting back with other groups on revisions we were making. We created a 2-page summary version and a podcast very much aimed at staff so that we could really share what we were doing with everyone in a tangible and accessible way that wasn't going to need them to sit down and read an entire strategy. After that, an updated draft was presented to the Impact Committee. We then did a PML-wide consultation and had a survey-based feedback process. And we also hosted workshops where any staff were invited to come along. We presented the impact plan, and we were there to answer questions and just talk through what we were doing and give them an opportunity to feed into the process and give us ideas as well. Finally, in kind of early 21, a revised version, pretty much final version, went to the Board of Trustees here and was signed off by them. We created a 12-month action plan to actually show what our delivery was. So the impact plan encompassed impact across the organisation and different teams and such like, but the action plan was much more about Dawn and I's role in that delivery. And then finally, in about February 2021, it was signed off by our Impact Committee. And obviously through that whole process, we had Saskia to go back to voice some of our stresses and vent to at times, and also some of our successes and joys as well. So it was really good to have Saskia involved and have that external perspective to keep giving us feedback on what we were doing and giving us ideas. Yes, and I'm going to hand over to Dawn.
Brilliant. Well, this is the theory of change that we actually came up with as a result of evolution from Saskia's earlier version. You'll see the impacts have actually changed from what Saskia put as the stick areas, and we've changed them to much more sort of impacts are not discipline dependent or dependent on sector, so that actually anybody in the institute can feel like engaged with impact, and they can think they can actually work towards these impacts. We actually spent a lot of time looking at various people's definitions of impact actually, and none really resonated with us. So actually, we actually defined our own terms for impact, and we actually said impact to be a marked change in approach, behaviour, policy, or practice, or product. So it's actually the point of change in something. And the ultimate benefits, we've got things like a clean and healthy, resilient ocean. And these, what we defined as the positive difference that the research has on the world beyond academia. So anything that can benefit society, the environment, or even wider than that. And if you look down to the enablers in orange, these are really the sort of structure of our plan. So we have all of these as various sections within the plan. So this is actually more of the structure. We've added along the top, which I'm just about to see, like develop a strong organisational impact focus, which is this really high level goal. I've been really, really lucky that we've actually been able to embed it at the same time as the science strategy and the PML strategy were being developed. So they got really embedded into the PML documents. So we've got things like provide impact leadership. So we're showing things like staff are recognised and rewarded for their roles in impact. And we actually have lots of dedicated staff working on impact. Jenny and I both working on impact, but also these science to impact area coordinators have time towards this. And their role is also very much embedded in our plan. We're working very hard to build capacity and capability. So we provided lots of training, tools, templates and guides. And we've also been working to support proposal development and try and get impact embedded into the proposal. So we've got time when these are funded to actually do impact activities. Also, communication with the staff is really important. So we try and provide regular updates. Jenny's always emailing them. We provide inputs to our PML newsletter, and also they can see through our impact narratives as well. But across all of this, we've actually got 2 cross-cutting themes, and these go through the whole of our impact activities. So we've got coordinator of stakeholder events, analysis, can't see that, it's hidden, and also monitoring and evaluation of impact. So I'll just move on to the next slide. So as Jem said, this really wasn't without challenges, but what the really biggest challenge probably for us was actually to get sufficient time resources allocated within what was a really strange time, a real changing context. We were having funding cuts due to the ODA cuts. There was COVID, was turned the whole world upside down, and also lots of our funding streams were quite uncertain due to Brexit. So we've actually been, we were lucky to get quite a fair bit of time, but to mitigate against this, we're actually applying for external funding to support our work, so we can see it grow into the future, hopefully, if it is funded. As Jenny's already touched on it, it's the first impact plan for PML. So there was different expectations within the organisation about what it should be. And a few we did get people, not saying complaining, but we did take some comments about it. And then we just had to really just listen and respond to them, and so that we could really address their concerns. So it was a really two-way process, and it went on lots and lots of iterations. It's always difficult to reach some of the more less engaged staff, but we've really tried very hard. We've done this by presenting about impact at every opportunity and delivering a really wide range of tools and training in lots of different formats to suit people's learning styles. We've also tried to emphasise that actually impact doesn't actually have to take a lot of their time. There's Jenny and I there to support them, and lots of tools. So we're just trying to show them that it doesn't actually need to take an awful lot of time. It's just that one little extra step. So hopefully we are gradually actually reaching more and more people within the laboratory. So the first year, I'm sorry, we're nearly at the end of our time. Really our key achievements have probably been our training programme, the project proposals, and we actually had an impact event. So we've developed 3 different training courses, and we've trained over 70 participants across, I think, 7 sessions, 7 half-day sessions these are. And as a result of this, we've been really pleased to be invited to deliver training for external organisations, such as the UN Decade of Oceans Programme and the UK Energy Research Council. Over the course of the past year or so, we've contributed to 19 proposals. Some have been funded, some haven't. Many we're still waiting the outcome of them. But lots of them really important. We've actually included time for an impact coordination role in some of these new projects. So there should be staff who are there to actually coordinate the impact of the project. And back in April, we held an impact event. This was a one-day event, and it was held, attended by over 50% of our science staff. So we're really pleased with the attendance, and nearly all of them were in person. And as part of this event, we actually set up a research impact advisory panel comprised of quite a lot of stakeholders, and they all attended the impact event. They contributed to the discussions, and also to co-development sessions where we were trying to co-develop project ideas. So what's next? So we really want to build on our training offer. We're hoping to develop some new courses, and we provide this both internally and externally. We continue to seek external funding, particularly for our impact work. And we really want to develop the role of the Research Impact Advisory Panel so they can really add value to our work at PML. We want to continue with lots of more co-development workshops, particularly around the Science to Impact challenge area themes. And we're working on testing and refining our methodology for these challenge-led workshops that you can see an example of in the pictures. And once we've really got this nailed down, we really hope to share that. So last slide, and for further information, if you'd like to look at our website, if you look at pml.ac.uk/impact, you can see a 2-page summary of our impact plan and also the case studies that we submitted to the ref. And we're always happy to chat with people. So if you email impact@pml.ac.uk, That reaches both Jenny and I. So we'd be really happy to take any questions if there's a few minutes left. I'm sorry we ran over a little bit.
Fine, no problem at all. Great to hear this, and hopefully this is just kind of solidifying what we've learned from the first element, the first segment of the session. So over to you. We've got a few questions already here. I'm not sure if you've had a chance to look at any of these yet. I think this last question has been answered to an extent already by what you were just saying there in terms of researcher engagement, but a bit more on some of the tools that you mentioned might be nice as well, Ruth is asking. So over to you both.
Sure. Okay. So we've really developed quite a range of different things. So stuff like templates for theory of change, that really to get researchers started on that process, and we kind of try to eliminate as much time requirements as they need. So you're obviously having templates and starting points, and also making sure examples of other theories of change that have been submitted in proposals are available to them, so that they can look at examples and even steal text, you know, if it's relevant to their own proposals. What else? We've got monitoring logs for actually using in a project to record evidence, record pathway, as well as impact evidence, which is kind of taken from the MEAL plan, the monitoring, evaluation, accountability and learning approach that's used initially in international development, but it is spreading. And we've really taken that and adapted it to the research context here and provide templates as well as training on how to embed that in projects. But yeah, even down to template letters of to request testimonials from stakeholders. We have examples of that on our Teams page here, so that any of our researchers can go and kind of have a starting point and not start from scratch with anything. But also, you know, it's really helpful that our time is, people can always come to us. Sorry, what was the first one was around, how well do the researchers engage? And we still have the same issues as any organisation, where there's some that are really, really quick to engage and really positive, and others are slower. And you know, it's like Dawn said, just trying to do a real range of different things, and particularly when it comes to proposals, when they work on it and they need us, that's often the best point at which they're really quick to engage with us, because they suddenly realise it benefits them.
So I think we will close things at this point. Thanks, Daniel, for your kind words. I'd be interested to know the answer to your question as well. But at this point, it is past, so I'm going to formally close things at this point. But if anyone wants to stay for some informal chat and any additional questions, then if you are able to, then please do. Just to remind you, this is the Impact Culture website with all of my free resources on here, including the podcast and my Impact Culture Toolkit, all of the key ideas from this book that you can implement straight away. And very relevant to what we've just been talking about, our next training session is on impact planning using logic models and theory of change. We've actually going to contract that to a 60-minute session now, because we've got this issue of people dropping off after the first hour. So it's going to, and some different speakers as well, actually. So it's going to be some real nice examples with some leading experts in these techniques, and some nice examples of how that works in practice. So come along on 31st of August for our next session, but you can see and sign up for the rest via the link in the chat. It's been a pleasure. Thank you everyone for coming along. It's fantastic to see you all again. And for anyone who's got a bit of extra time, please do feel free to hang around. Great.